Hey, are you guys ready for some more Edward Tulane? I know I am. Our poor friend started out such a selfish, egotistical, narcissistic rabbit, but he's changing, isn't he? He's felt fear, he's felt longing, he's felt something that he thought might be love. And now he's all alone again. All alone, just kicked out of the rail car. His doggy friend Lucy howling with sadness as Bull and Lucy ride away on the train. Guys. In the morning, the sun rose, and the cricket's song gave way to a bird song, and an old woman came walking down the dirt road and tripped right over Edward. She said, and pushed at Edward with her fishing pole. Looks like a rabbit, she said. She put down her basket and bent and stared at Rabbit. Only, he ain't real. She stood back up. She said again. She rubbed her back. What I say is, there's a use for everything, and everything has its use. Well, that's what I say. Edward didn't care what she said. The terrible ache he had felt the night before had gone away and had been replaced with a different feeling, one of hollowness and despair. Remember, despair is the absence of hope. He has lost all hope. Pick me up or don't pick me up, the rabbit thought. Makes no difference to me. The old lady picked him up. She bent him double and put him in her basket, which smelled of weeds and fish, and she kept walking, swinging the basket and singing, Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Edward, in spite of himself, listened. I've seen troubles too, he thought. You bet I have, and apparently they aren't over yet. Edward was right. His troubles were not over. The old woman found a use for him, all right. She hung him up from a pole in her vegetable garden. She nailed his ears to a wooden pole and spread his arms out as if he were flying and attached his paws to the pole by wrapping pieces of wire around them. In addition to Edward, pie pans hung from the pole. They clinked and clanked and shone in the morning sun. I ain't a doubt in my mind that you can scare them off, the old lady said. Scare who off? Edward wondered. Birds, he soon discovered. Crows. They came flying at him, cawing and screeching and wheeling over his head, diving at his ears. Go on, Clyde, said the woman. She clapped her hands. You gotta act ferocious. Clyde? Edward felt a weariness so intense wash over him that he thought he might actually be able to sigh out loud. Would the world never tire of calling him by the wrong name? The old woman clapped her hands again. Now, come on, get to work, Clyde, she said. Scare them birds off. And then she walked away from him, out in the garden and towards the small house. Look at our boy. He's been turned into a scarecrow. You see those pie tins, those pie pans, making all that noise, and he just hangs there as birds peck at him. The birds were insistent. They flew around his head. They tugged at the loose threads on his sweater. One large crow in particular would not leave the rabbit alone. He perched on the pole and screamed a dark message in Edward's left ear. Caw! 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 Without ceasing. As the sun rose higher and shone meaner and brighter, Edward became somewhat dazed. He mistook the large crow for Pellegrina. Go ahead, he thought. Turn me into a warthog if you want. I don't even care. I'm done with caring. Caw! Caw! Said the Pellegrina crow. Finally, the sun set and the birds flew away. Edward hung by his ears and looked at the night sky. He saw the stars, but for the first time in his life he looked at them and he felt no comfort. Instead, he felt mocked. He felt as though they were making fun of him. You're down there all alone, the stars seemed to say to him, and we're up here in our constellations, together. I have been loved, Edward told the stars. So, said the stars, what difference does that make when you're all alone? Edward could think of no answer to that question. Eventually the sky lightened and the stars disappeared one by one. The birds returned and the old woman came back into the garden. This time she brought a boy with her. Chapter 16. Look at the little picture of that fella. What a beautiful drawing that is. Look at him. Let's meet this guy. Bryce, said the old woman, get away from that rabbit. I ain't paying you to just stand there. Yes, ma'am, said Bryce. He wiped his nose with the back of his hand and continued to look up at Edward. The boy's eyes were brown with flecks of gold shining in them. Hey, he whispered to Edward. A crow settled on Edward's head, and the boy flapped his arms and shouted, Now go on! Get on, bird! And the bird spread his wings and flew away. Bryce! Shouted the old woman. Ma'am, said Bryce. Now you get away from that rabbit. You do your work. I ain't gonna say it again. Yes'm, said Bryce, and he wiped his hand across his nose. Now I'll be back to get you, he said to Edward. The rabbit spent the day hanging by his ears, baking in the hot sun, watching the old woman and Bryce weed and hoe the garden. Whenever the woman wasn't looking, Bryce raised his hand and waved at Edward. The birds circled over Edward's head, laughing at him. What would it be like to have wings, Edward wondered. If he had wings when he was tossed overboard, well, he would not have sunk to the bottom of the sea. Instead, he would have flown in the opposite direction, up into deep thought, into that bright blue sky. And when Lolly took him to the dump, she would have flown out of the garbage and followed her and landed on her head, holding on with sharp claws. And on the train, when the man had kicked him, Edward would not have fallen to the ground. Instead, Edward would not have fallen to the ground. Instead, he would have risen up and sat on top of the train and laughed at the man. Caw! 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 In late afternoon, Bryce and the old lady left for the field. Bryce winked at Edward and walked past him. One of the crows lighted on Edward's shoulder and tapped with his beak at Edward's china face, reminding the rabbit with each tap that he had no wings, that he could not fly, and that he could not move on his own at all in any way. Dusk descended over the field, and then came true dark. A whippoorwill sang out over and over again, Whippoorwill! 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 It was the saddest sound Edward had ever heard. And then came another song, the hum of a harmonica. Bryce stepped out of the shadows. Hey, he said to Edward. He wiped his nose with the back of his hand and he played another bit of the song on the harmonica. Well, I bet you didn't think I'd come back, but here I am. I come to save you. Too late, thought Edward as Bryce climbed the pole and worked at the wires that were tied around his wrists. I'm nothing but a hollow rabbit. Too late, thought Edward as Bryce pulled the nails out of his ears. I'm only a doll made of china. But when the last nail was out, he fell forward into Bryce's arm, and the rabbit felt a rush of relief. And the feeling of relief was followed by pure joy. Perhaps, he thought, it's not too late. Perhaps it's not too late at all for me to be saved. Bryce slung Edward over his shoulder, and he started to walk. Now I come to get you for Sarah Ruth, Bryce said. You don't know Sarah Ruth. She's my sister, and she's sick. Well, she had herself a baby doll made out of china, and she loved that baby doll, but he broke it. He broke it. He was drunk and stepped on that baby's head and smashed it into 100 million pieces. Them pieces was so small I couldn't get them back together. I tried, and I just couldn't. I just tried and tried. At this point in the story, Bryce stopped walking and shook his head and wiped at his nose with the back of his hand. Sarah Ruth ain't had nothing to play with since. He won't buy her nothing. He says she don't need nothing. He says she don't need nothing 'cause she ain't gonna live. But he don't know. Bryce started to walk again. He don't know, he said. Who he wasn't clear to Edward. What was clear is that he was being taken to a child to make up for the loss of a doll. A doll. Ugh! How Edward hated dolls. And to be thought of as a likely replacement for a doll offended him. But still, he had to admit, highly preferable, and it was highly a preferable alternative than it was better than being a scarecrow, essentially. The house in which Bryce and Sarah Ruth lived in was so small and crooked that Edward did not believe at first that it was even a house. He mistook it instead for like a chicken coop. Inside there were 2 beds and a kerosene lamp and not much else. Bryce laid Edward at the foot of one of those beds and then lit the lamp. Sarah, Bryce whispered. Sarah Ruth, you gotta wake up now, honey. I brought you something. He took the harmonica out of his pocket and played the beginning of a simple melody. The little girl sat up in her bed and immediately started to cough. Bryce put his hand on her back. Now, that's all right now, he told her. It's okay. She was young, like maybe 4 years old, and she had white blonde hair, and even in the poor light of the lamp, Edward could see that her eyes were the same gold-flecked brown as Bryce's. Now, that's right, said Bryce. Now, you go on ahead. You just cough and cough. Sarah Ruth obeyed. She coughed and coughed and coughed. On the wall of the cabin, the kerosene light cast her trembling shadow hunched over and small. The coughing was the saddest sound that Edward had ever heard, sadder even than the mournful call of the whippoorwill. Finally, Sarah Ruth stopped. Bryce said, Want to see what I brung you? Sarah Ruth nodded. Now you gotta close your eyes. The little girl closed her eyes. Bryce picked up Edward and held him so that he was standing up straight, like a soldier at the end of her bed. All right now, you can open them. Sarah Ruth opened her eyes, and Bryce moved Edward's china legs and china arms so it looked like he was dancing. Sarah Ruth laughed and clapped her hands. Rabbit, she said. Well, he's for you, honey, said Bryce. Sarah Ruth looked first at Edward, and then at Bryce, and then back at Edward again, her eyes just wide and disbelieving. Well, he's yours. Mine? Sarah Ruth, Edward was soon to discover, rarely said more than one word at a time. Words, at least several of them strung together in a sentence, well, they made her cough. She limited herself. She said only what needed to be said. Yours, said Bryce. I got 'em special for you, little sister. This knowledge provoked another fit of coughing in Sarah Ruth, and she hunched over once again. When the fit was done, she uncurled herself and held out her arms. Oh. That's right, said Bryce, and he handed Edward to her. Baby, said Sarah Ruth. She rocked Edward back and forth and stared down at him and smiled. There's Bryce, sweet little Bryce, being a good big brother, playing the harmonica for his sick, sick baby sister Sarah Ruth, who's cradling Edward in her arms. Never in his life had Edward been cradled like a baby. Abilene had not done it, nor had Nellie, and most certainly Bull had not. It was this singular sensation, so special, to be held so gently yet so fiercely, to be stared down at with so much love. Edward felt the whole of his china body fill with warmth. You gonna give him a name, honey? Bryce asked. Jangles, said Sarah Ruth without taking her eyes off of Edward. Jangles, huh? Well, that's a good name. Well, I like that name. Bryce patted Sarah Ruth on the head. She continued to stare down at Edward. Hush now, hush, she said to Edward as she rocked him back and forth. From the minute I first saw him, said Bryce, I knew he belonged to you. Well, I said it to myself. I said, well, that rabbit is for Sarah Ruth for sure. Jangles, murmured Sarah Ruth. Outside the cabin, thunder cracked, and then came the sound of rain falling on the tin roof. Sarah rocked Edward back and forth, and Bryce took out his harmonica and started to play, making his song keep rhythm with the rain. Bryce and Sarah Ruth had a father. Early the next morning, when the light was gray and uncertain, Sarah Ruth was sitting up in bed coughing, and the father came home. He picked Edward up by one of his ears and said, Well, I ain't never. Well, it's a baby doll, said Bryce. Don't look like no baby doll to me. Edward, hanging by one ear, was frightened. This, he was certain, was the man who crushed the heads of china dolls. Jangles, said Sarah Ruth between coughs, and she held out her arms. Well, he's hers, said Bryce. Now he belongs to her. The father dropped Edward on the bed, and Bryce picked up the rabbit and handed him to Sarah Ruth. It don't matter anyway, said the father. It don't make no difference. None of it. It does so matter, said Bryce. Don't you sass me, boy, said the father. He raised his hand and slapped Bryce across the mouth, and then he turned and he left the house. Now, you ain't got no worry about him, said Bryce to Edward. He ain't nothing but a bully. And besides, he don't hardly never come home. Fortunately, the father did not come back that day. Bryce went out to work, and Sarah Ruth spent the day in bed, holding Edward in her lap and playing with a box filled with buttons. Pretty, she said to Edward as she lined up the buttons on the bed and arranged them into different patterns. Sometimes, when a coughing fit was particularly bad, she squeezed Edward so tight that he was afraid that he might crack in two. Also, in between coughing fits, she took to sucking on one or the other of Edward's ears. Normally, Edward would have found that intrusive, clingy behavior of this sort of thing totally annoying and disgusting. But there was something about Sarah Ruth. He wanted to take care of her. He wanted to protect her. He wanted to do more for her. At the end of the day, Bryce returned with a biscuit for Sarah Ruth and a ball of twine for Edward. Sarah Ruth held the biscuit in both hands and took small little baby bites. Now you eat all that up, honey. And come here and let me hold Jangles, said Bryce. Him and me got a surprise for you. Bryce took Edward off in a corner of the room, and with a pocket knife he cut off lengths of twine and tied them to Edward's arms and feet, and then tied the twine to sticks of wood. Now see, all day I've been thinking about it, Bryce said. What we're going to do is make you dance. Sarah Ruth loves dancing. Mama used to hold on to her and dance her around the room. Now you eating that biscuit? Bryce called out to Sarah Ruth. Uh-huh, said Sarah Ruth. You hold on, honey. We got a surprise for you. Bryce stood up. Now close your eyes, he told her. He took Edward over to the bed and said, Okay, you can open 'em up now. Sarah Ruth opened her eyes. Dance, Jangles, said Bryce, and then, moving the strings with the sticks with his one hand, Bryce made Edward dance and drop and sway, and the whole time, at the same time, with the other hand, he held onto the harmonica and played a bright and lively tune. Well, he had turned Edward into a puppet. Sarah Ruth laughed. She laughed until she started to cough, and then Bryce laid Edward down and took Sarah Ruth in his lap and rocked her and rubbed on her back. Now you want some fresh air? He asked her. Let's go out of this. Let's get you out of this nasty old air, okay? Bryce carried his sister outside. He left Edward lying on the bed, and the rabbit, staring up at the smoke-stained ceiling, thought again about having wings. If he had them, he thought, he would fly high above this world to where the air was clear and sweet, and he would take Sarah Ruth with him. He would carry her in his arms. Surely so high above the world, she would be able to breathe without coughing. After a minute, Bryce came back inside, still carrying Sarah Ruth. She wants you too, he said. Jangles, said Sarah Ruth, and she held out her arms. So Bryce held Sarah Ruth, and Sarah Ruth held Edward, and the three of them stood outside. Bryce said, "You got to look for fallen stars. Them are the ones with magic." They were quiet for a long time, all three of them looking up at the sky. Sarah Ruth stopped coughing. Edward thought that maybe she had fallen asleep. "There," she said, and she pointed to a star that was streaking across the sky. "Well, make a wish, honey," Bryce said in a voice high and tight. "Well, that's your star. Now you can make a wish for anything you want." And even though it was Sarah Ruth's star, Edward wished on it too. Oh, I'm going to go cry in private now. This story just gets me every time. I hope you're enjoying it as much as I am. We'll talk soon.